both the Strauss Center and the Clements Center. We are very excited to welcome back to UT Austin Colonel Liam Collins. Liam is the director of the Modern War Institute at West Point. He's a career Special Forces officer. His deployments have ranged from combat deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan to basically every other corner of the globe. He's been decorated repeatedly, 2 Combat Valor Awards. Previously ran the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. Its teaching touches on an array of topics. I won't even attempt to cover the full range, but I think most interesting of late, I want to find out, how did you do at NBC's Spartan competition? How did your team do?
It was we finished 3rd, so we did pretty poorly, I guess.
I don't know, I bet you beat a lot of other teams. That's impressive. He's been here before. He spoke for the Brumley program back in 2015 when Brumley fellow, our own Jody Rosenstein, who many of you will know, was the host. And we're just excited you're back. The topic couldn't be more timely. Russia, Ukraine, hybrid warfare. Welcome back, Colonel.
All right, thanks. All right, so between 2016 and 2018, I went over to Ukraine with General Abzade every 4 to 6 weeks. So that was kind of like my moonlighting job while I was trying to do my day job back at West Point. And so he pulled me in 2016, so I guess this is kind of how these things come together. So Secretary appointed him as Senior Defense Advisor to Ukraine for defense reform, so advising their President, their Minister of Defense, and Chief of Defense for defense reform, and then on our side kind of helping shape and execute U.S. policy. So he tells the Pentagon, Officer Secretary of Defense for Policy, hey, I want, retired 4-star general, and they don't give him a staff, and they say, hey, I want you to, he tells them, I want Liam to go with me, and they're like, well, we don't have money for that. He's like, you're not listening to me. I want Liam to go. He's like, well, we don't have money. He's like, well, I'm not going unless Liam goes. They're like, oh, we got money for that. So it's amazing it be. So anyway, so our first trip over there is in October of 2016. So what's going on in October of 2016? In the U.S.
An election.
There's an election going on, right? You might remember. So, of course, their president's interested in this. So they're flying to the east, right, to the combat zone for the first time out there. So General Abzade's sitting next to President Poroshenko, their Minister and Chief of Defense, and President Poroshenko asks him, who's going to win the election? And he says, I'm pretty sure Clinton's going to win. He's like, are you sure? So he's like, I've lived long enough to know you can never be sure about anything, but I'm pretty sure Clinton's going to win. He said, what happens if Trump wins? General Abzade looks out the window, points east, says, we're going to advise them. So in November, we're over there on election day, and we're like, holy cow, Trump might win this thing. So we're back again in December, doing the ribbon cutting ceremony for the new Special Operations Training Facility, and we see President Poroshenko, and he comes up, your joke is not so funny anymore. I said, well, I wouldn't have made it if I would have thought he was going to win. So right, it's the old lesson we all know. You always got to be careful about the jokes you make. So I'll be talking about hybrid war, Ukraine and U.S. Policy. So we'll go a little bit on kind of, so you can understand the impact of the war, a little bit on hybrid war, and then kind of, we'll talk about Russia in particular, and then kind of the way ahead a little bit. So right, this is what people think of when they think of Syria, right? Right, a lot of destruction going on, but when you think of Ukraine, it's not really in the news, right? Maybe it was in the news back in 2016, but it's not really front and center anymore. Given our news cycle, right, moving on to something else. But this is what it looks like, and if you got the kind of down here in the lower, corner of the map, right, the shaded, right, this is Ukraine, those shaded areas, right, 1, Crimea in the south, and 2 down in the southeast, the Donbas areas it's called, right, the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, right, part of them that's under the control of the Russian-led separatists. So that area there is about 2/3 the size of Ireland and a roughly the same size population, or at least pre-war, roughly the same size population. So when you're thinking about what that is to the east of Donbas, right, that's Ireland when you're thinking about what it is. If you think about the impact of the conflict, I mean, how many lives did we lose, soldiers did we lose in Iraq?
5,000.
Right, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000, right? That's roughly what Ukraine has lost. A smaller country has lost, right, in a much shorter period of time in the west there, in the east, right? And they've lost a number of number of civilians killed, right? Destruction. But you think of, okay, what's the economic impact of the conflict right there, right? Their GDP, effectively cut in half. yeah, sure, you lost Crimea to the south, and think of, right, the land that you lost in Donbas, but right, still, that's a significant hit. How much, right, during the Great Recession, how much did our GDP recede by? Right, the Great Recession, what did it go down by? Anybody guess? Student?
Maybe 8%.
We got a guess for 8%, about 3%, right? And that's a Great Recession. So getting cut by 50%, right, pretty significant. You know, it's ticked back up somewhat in the last few years. And then, right, think about the social impact, right? The closing of these borders. I mean, for the Ukrainians, this is the equivalent of us going and invading Canada, right? That is really what it's like. Completely unimaginable to Ukrainians that this would happen, right? And that's what it is from their perspective. And really, you know, internally displaced, you know, personnel, you know, or persons about 1.5 million. Right, so pretty significant impact in terms of the conflict. Okay, I mean, kind of go back, you know, understand a little bit of history, right, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, right, when the republics all kind of broke apart, become independent nations, they had to keep the borders that they had at that time, right? They weren't able to redraw them, so that, you know, right, just like we see problems with, you know, in the Middle East and elsewhere with these borders that are drawn, the same challenge here, right? So, you know, talk about Georgia in a little bit. But the main thing to consider here is, right, Crimea wasn't always part of Ukraine. It was given to them by the Russians, I believe, in the 50s. And so when they gave it to them, it wasn't something they ever thought about having to, you know, get back later or something. And so maybe if they could have redrawn the lines in 1991, you wouldn't have had this problem with Crimea in 2014. Okay, this, you should, if you want to, right, if I tell you that Ukraine has 45 million people, that means absolutely nothing to you. Right? But think of it compared to California, roughly the population the size of California in terms of size, right? You understand this, roughly the size of Texas when you think about how big it is. Dialect, roughly 2/3 Ukraine is the primary language, roughly 1/3 Russian is the primary language. And you see, right, kind of on the map here, you know, the darker, you know, higher percentage where Russia is the primary language, and then the lighter it is, Ukraine is the primary language. And don't confuse your thing, just because someone speaks Russian means they want to be Russian and want that to be part of Russia, right? They, you know, just like in the Baltics, the ethnic Russians that live there, they kind of like having civil liberties, and they like having generally a higher standard of living than the neighbors across the border. Even if they, you know, even if some of them feel that they're Russian more than they are Ukrainian. And then when we're in the, you know, in the East, we've been there, and they rotate troops through the East just like we would rotate troops in Afghanistan or Iraq, and they have forces from the East that speak Russian, and they're rotating in there, fighting the Russian-led separatists just like any other force. So don't confuse the fact that, right, just because they speak Russian, that they want to be Russian. Right, so Putin will say, right, or others, Mearsheimer will say, hey, this is Putin's just a normal response to the expansion of NATO, right? It's a realism response. You know, I think a lot of others with experience in the region would disagree. But you can see, right, how NATO has kind of expanded over time. But to keep in mind, right, I mean, Ukraine and kind of Georgia have special status, right, to Russia, right? They will always, their interest in Ukraine and Georgia will always be greater than ours. That doesn't mean we give them a blank check to do what they want there, but their interest will always be greater there. Okay, so we kind of go look at hybrid war. So hybrid war, think of it as a mix of conventional and irregular war in a highly fluid and efficient format using modern information measures. Again, a combination of regular, irregular, flexible, fluid, using modern information measures. Is this new? We have some heads shaking, no. Right, this is nothing new. This goes back to, you know, the beginning of warfare. Think of our own Revolutionary War, right? We had regulars, we had irregulars, right? We had propaganda, right? This is nothing new. The difference is, right, this, you know, lethality has increased, right? Modern information, right? Information flow is so much quicker, right? And so this is what changed, but the idea of it has not. And this goes back to Clausewitz, right? He talked about direct, which is where he spent most of his writing on, the direct conflict, right, aimed at capturing territories, defeating enemies in the battlefield, and then the indirect, right, attriting them and tiring them out. And so hybrid's kind of in the middle, right? It can move more towards that conventional, or it can be move more towards that exhaustion strategy. And so Russia had experience, right, fighting the Chechens in the 90s. and kind of learning from that experience there, as the Chechens kind of would do that. They would kind of do guerrilla attacks, but then at the same time, they could come together and conduct large-scale, ambush operations against the Russian forces. And so they learned from that. And so kind of moving forward in 2007, they moved this Soviet memorial from downtown town to a kind of cemetery in the outskirts of town, along with some Red Army graves. So this pissed the Russians off, so what they conducted was a relatively unsophisticated denial of service attack, but nonetheless, it crippled the Estonian government, their banking system, right, freezing everybody out of getting their money from ATMs, and really kind of crippled them for 2 to 3 days. Of course, the Russians deny it, but it was the Russians that did it. But we kind of see this is the first case of really seeing, offensive cyber against another nation for political purposes. And then the next summer, right, 2008 is when we see the Russians go into Georgia, and so they really learned from this conflict. So this is not a great map necessarily, right? But Georgia is in here, right? These shaded areas, right? Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These have always been kind of semi-autonomous regions within Georgia. Russian peacekeepers were in South Ossetia, and they fought a civil war within Georgia back in 1991 when they gained independence. So South Ossetia, every summer they typically get a little swirly, send some artillery shells across across that border, the administrative border, into Georgia. Georgia might return fire, kind of low-level conflict. But in 2008, Russia did their large-scale exercise that they do every year. But instead of all the Russian forces going home, right, they left divisions right on the Georgian border to the north. And so what Russia was trying to do was basically provoke Georgia into going into South Ossetia, which they did. But the international community, for the most part, saw this as a preemptive attack by Georgia. Right, the Russians were going to come across. It was there. Right. Also, here's the first time we kind of see cyber being used at the same time as with kinetic operations, the conventional forces. And those cyber attacks actually started 2 weeks in advance of the ground forces moving across the border. Right. So it was pretty obvious that the Russians, this was a planned operation. And again, it was kind of instigated because of Georgia's desire to join NATO and the EU, and so this was kind of Russia pushing back on that. Ultimately, the war only lasted 5 days, right? There was no way that the Georgians could overcome Russian forces when they came across the border. Pushed out here, not too far from Tbilisi, and they only have 4 brigades. The Georgians only had 4 brigades, and their best brigade was in Iraq at the time, supporting the coalition effort down there. But nonetheless, the Georgians fought, when they actually did fight them, in kind of equal numbers, fought fairly well against the Russians. So the Russians learned from this and they studied it. They said, hey, conscript army kind of sucks, right? We got to have some, they don't fight very well. And so if we're going to go somewhere, don't do conscripts. In terms of international, or in terms of IO, information operations, they really lost the IO battle, right? They were hoping to provoke Georgia into conducting its attack. But for the most part, the world saw it as a preemptive attack. And so they're like, hey, we've got to have better messaging on this. And they kind of learned also, hey, when you send large formations across the border, it's really hard to win that battle of opinion, and the public opinion on that. So they looked at that. Also, what we see all here is kind of, electronic warfare, trying to cut off Tbilisi, the capital, the government, from the units in the field, so they can't have their command and control. Get those orders from their political or military leadership in the capital. So we see a combination of kind of cyber with electronic warfare, aimed at those C2 mechanisms for that. And see if there's anything else, limited electronic warfare. And then Russian reforms follow from this. So what's going on? What are we doing at the time in 2008? Where are we at?
Presidential election.
Okay, but we're coming right off of the surge in Iraq, right? Surge started in early 2007. We're kind of tapering off the end of the surge, right? So we, for the most part, were not paying attention to what was going on over here. And the Russians were studying this intensively. And so between this and the next 6 years, they perfected the ability to do this, at least in a neighboring country. Right, in terms of IO, right? I mean, who has not been to an international hotel anywhere in the world and not found RT on the TV, right? I mean, establishing these, right, media outlets, media messaging all over the world, right? And so that's what they learned from there. So in 2004, right, this was clearly something, a war plan that, right, that they had on the shelf, and they were just waiting for the time to execute it, right, and the opportunity to bring it itself in February of 2014. Right, so following the Maidan Revolution, right, President Yanukovych flees, right, they install interim president, right, Ukraine makes some not so great decisions, right, some language laws and other things angering the ethnic Russians, right, and so, at least, and then in Crimea, right, this is where we see the little green men going in, right, they learned from Georgia, right, sending large formations across the border is not a good thing. Let's put little green men in. It didn't hurt, right? They had a status of forces agreement. So even though they were increasing the number of forces flowing into Sebastopol, their port there, it'd be the same as us, right? If we have an agreement with Germany that says we can have 150,000 soldiers and we only have 100,000, and we're inserting 50,000, right? Not all over the country in little green men, but into the base there, right? It's not necessarily it's not a violation of the status of forces agreement at the time. Clearly, little green men were, right? But right, those little green men in there, ultimately, right, seizing the government facilities in Crimea, right, through various measures, and then ousting the government, right, establishing a new local government. We'll kind of go into it a little bit more detail, but right, establishing a new government. What does that government do? It's going to ask, right, the international community for help. That's what we do, right? Responsibility to protect, right, using Western norms against the West. And then who's going to come to their defense? The Russians will come, right? And ultimately, right, they vote for independence and then annexation with Russia. Ultimately, Russia's able to seize Crimea without firing a single shot, right? Stroke of genius. And unfortunately, right, I think they took the Ukrainians listened to the advice coming from the West that was, hey, don't resist. We'll solve this diplomatically, which I think was a big mistake. Or at least that's what the evidence points to, right? But what we saw here is, right, well, a lot of information operations, right, establishing, really just disinformation, just enough to make it questionable, right? I guarantee every Western leader knew what little green men were, they knew who they were, right, but it gave them enough plausible deniability. Really, I don't think it's plausible, I don't think there's such a thing as plausible deniability, I think it's just deniability, right? It's not plausible, right, but enough deniability because Germany, France, others, right? They don't want to, right? They don't want to get involved in Ukraine. They just want to return to trade with Russia and just kind of turn away the other way. So ultimately, right? Any excuse they have to not act, right? They're going to seize that, right? So, right? They claim we don't know who these people are, right? So using the information operations, electronic warfare, right? Really cutting off the forces down there in Crimea from Kyiv. Right? So they establish a media monopoly, and they're going after, right, targets that they were seizing, right? Any kind of radio towers, TV towers, those kind of things, so they control, right, an information monopoly here within the region. Again, so that, right, the people at the bases, they don't know what to do, right? They might, and then the Russians might, right, either through, right, their sources, criminal gangs, right, non-government organizations that they're supporting in the area, right? If the soldiers are going to the base, and then you got a bunch of protesters outside the base, what do you do? Are you going to fight through these protesters to get to your weapons? What do you do, right? So these kind of things that they're doing. Right, cyber operations, the same kind of thing, right? Crippling, cutting those, right, command and control networks, right? And then the regular warfare kind of with those little green men. But again, within 30 days, I mean, sheer brilliance that they were able to take this without a shot being fired. So then kind of what follows in there. So then kind of out in the west, right, again, these are the two, right, the Luhansk Oblast and Donetsk Oblast, kind of like half of those, this is kind of where it is. Right, yeah, no doubt there are separatists out there that would like to be part of Russia. They are clearly the minority. But those those separatists are emboldened by what happened in Crimea. Russia provides them support. The Ukrainian army really had done nothing since the end of the Cold War, right? They'd atrophied to really be in a shell of what they were and really incapable of doing much. So volunteers and the army, went out to the west and really ended up, pushing these separatists and supported by Russian equipment and Russian advisors. Pretty much everybody from the kind of company command level on up. All those commanders are Russian, leading, right, separatist forces. pushed them to the border in August of 15, and then the Russians at that point went across the border en masse with Russian tank formations and other forces. Of course, which the Russians deny, or they say, hey, we can't control what our soldiers do when they're on vacation, or the term we use is leave, right? The way I equate it is like, I've got it, but when I used to go on what we call block leave, where the whole unit takes leave together, when I go on block leave, I would never go on leave with my entire platoon or company, and what we did, we sure didn't take our tanks with us and go across the border into Canada with us with the tanks, right? And so it's just not believable, right, that the Russians are just taking tanks across the border on their own, right? Or they just really have poor accountability of their equipment. Right, and so the Russians, right, the Ukrainians weren't gonna be able to stand toe-to-toe against, right, the Russian equipment, right, T-90 tanks, advanced systems that they had. Ultimately, what it does is they kind of hit where the shaded area is right here, tentative ceasefire with the Minsk I agreement in September of 14. It didn't really hold, and then really what we've been under since then is Minsk II agreement, which is February of 15. Which established kind of what you've got there now is kind of a trench line. It really looks kind of like World War I with modern technology. That's the best way to describe it. It's somewhat artificial because if it wasn't a ceasefire, maneuver warfare would kind of open up and the trenches would disappear. But nonetheless, that's what it looks like now. And what you have is, again, is tenuous ceasefire. No one's trying to really gain terrain, but you still have constant probing by the Russian-led separatist artillery, originating from the Russian-led separatist side, snipers, those kind of things that we see in that area. So any given week, you've still got probably anywhere from 0 to 2 Ukrainians dying, and 7 to 10 getting injured still to this day, pretty much on a weekly basis. But this is really kind of where we've been under since then. And again, Minsk II is really, the Ukrainians look at this as this is not, this agreement was made under duress, right? This is our sovereign territory. We just made this agreement under duress. And so the kind of the peace what Ambassador Volker's trying to do right now is to figure out what do you do with this piece here? And really, there's no starting point because the Russians want the border to be here, and the Ukrainians want it to be there. And so they really haven't made any progress in what to do there over the last 2 years. But for the Ukrainians, really what it is they look at it as the Budapest Agreement back in 1991 is kind of the agreement that it should be. They should have their sovereign territory back. So one author kind of lays out this in terms of how the Russians execute hybrid war, right? A preparatory phase, right? This is where they're looking for who can they exploit within the government, economic system, political leadership, who can be exploited, blackmailed, bribed, whatever it takes, right? That they can take advantage of later. Right, establishing media positions within that country and in the international community, looking for criminal organizations that they can use, find local oligarchs that can be dependent on the Russians, and then ultimately do it their bidding. And then figuring out how they can, and then information measures to anger local populists, exploit political, ethnic, religious tensions that might exist, right? Just leveraging those. So where is Russia doing this political preparation in the world? I hear U.S. Okay, my question is, where are they not doing it, right? Right. I mean, this is, right, I mean, heavily in Eastern Europe, but Western Europe and the West in general, and I'm sure other places as well. Right, and so really, and then they're moving on, right, the attack phase is what we saw at least in Ukraine, right? They haven't gone to this and elsewhere, right? But attack phase, right, exploiting these tensions, right, inserting these little green men. Okay, if these little green men were inserted in Germany, what would happen right now? If you got inserted into Germany, what would happen? War. No, well, maybe, but they probably just get arrested. Yeah. Right? Well, they're not getting arrested in Ukraine. Why? Because Russia has divisions lined up across their north and the east, right? And if they arrest them, they don't know what Russia will do with these massive formations to their north and east, right? And so it's somewhat dependent on this, but exploiting those tensions, right? Leveraging criminal organizations or other, right? So it's not just Crimea, kind of like stuff, brush fires are all over the country, so they really aren't sure what's going on. Again, cutting, right, electronic warfare, cyber to cut the command and control, so they really aren't sure what's going on. They can't give good guidance and direction. Right? leveraging these, right, the populace is dissatisfied with the government, which is not hard to do. Okay, if you think, right, if you look at Ukraine, typically their president's approval ratings over the last, couple decades, they might start out high right after the election, but for them it's really, they often view it as a choice between one corrupt oligarch or another. And so, Poroshenko, recently was sitting in the president's approval ratings in the teens, which is right on par with our Congress, right? It's not that hard to, a population that's disenfranchised with the government or dissatisfied with their government, it's easier to do there. Versus somewhere like the Baltics, where all three presidents typically hover around a 70% approval rating. So it's a lot harder to do there. And then moving into the stabilization phase, right? Locking in the gains they have there. Just like in Georgia, when we were in Georgia a few years, I brought a group of cadets over there to study on the borders with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. These used to be open borders. The Russians now have them completely closed on South Ossetia. Abkhazia is closed to just one single crossing point. If you go back to we'll go back to the map here. Right, so this shaded area that was red, that was ethnic kind of Georgians within there. Ethnic Georgians within South Ossetia and within Abkhazia. And so what they do to lock in their gains, right, now building actual fences up, a single crossing point, and then making Russian the only language that you can speak in South Ossetia or Abkhazia. Kind of the same thing in Crimea. And the idea, right, they're in it for the long game, right? There's no economic system, they have no economy in these countries. Russia's effectively propping up, 60% of plus of their GDP comes from Russia. But for Russia, it's a small price to pay to ensure that Georgia will never join NATO or EU, because it's hard to join NATO when you have contested borders, right? Who's going to let you in the club if we're going to have to come to an Article 5 and we don't even know where, right? You can't even control your own territory, right? So Russia's doing that, and again, kind of turning in the long game, right? So if they're, after 20 years or whatever, speaking Russian, right? That's all they know. And kind of the same thing then in Crimea, and ultimately kind of what they're trying to do in the Donbas, right? Just make it last long enough, and again, so that Ukraine can never join NATO or EU because they have these contested borders within it. In terms of Russian capabilities, so kind of more on the conventional side, what we see in the conflict, right, is as they were using, really this is more in the east, not so much in Crimea, because they will take Crimea, again, like I said, without firing a shot in large formations coming across the border. But don't forget, right, it was large formations on the border that helped them able to accomplish that they probably wouldn't have otherwise. Right, unmanned aerial vehicles, right, we see them using these pretty frequently over there. Ukrainians have some success recently with taking those down. But the idea, right, is if you can be seen, you can be targeted, right? Tying those in with artillery, so as soon as a unmanned aerial vehicle sees you, right, within 10 minutes, then artillery is going to fall on you. Unlike the U.S. that's invested in precision-guided munitions, the Russians invested in long-range, multiple-launch rocket systems, right? So they don't have to identify exactly where you are. They just have to take out what we call an entire grid square, right? Think of, several football fields, right? As long as we know we're close, they just launch it in there, and they're not so worried about collateral damage, right? And again, they'll use our Western norms to against us, right? So where are they going to, if they have artillery tubes, where are they going to set them up? Right in urban areas, right next to schools, hospitals, churches, right? Try to use our Western norms against us because we might be hesitant to launch a counter-strike against them. I talked a little bit about artillery, but in the Donbas, during the heavy fighting, was caused about 80% of the casualties. Again, kind of going back to World War II, World War I kind of numbers. But because of the artillery is such a casualty-producing weapon, it makes counter-battery radar. These systems like down in the lower left corner there that can tell where artillery strike is originating from. What's the problem with these systems? Anybody know? What's the problem with these radars? Right, huge electromagnetic signature, right? And so you can't just turn these systems on, right? Because then they'll be targeted. So the trick is, how do you turn the systems on just at the right time? And then you got to get them underground, because as soon as they illuminate themselves, right, from far away, right, from the electronics signature that it gives off, on the electromagnetic spectrum, you can identify them. Same thing, right, that they've seen, with the through cell phones or other things, where the Russians not so much talk about it here a little bit, but kind of a combination of cyber electronic warfare, information operations all together, with kind of pinpoint propaganda. The soldiers, they have their cell phones out there. I don't know why they do, but it's just kind of giving them away. but they might have an artillery strike, and then shortly after the artillery strike, everybody gets a text message saying, hey, you know, your corrupt oligarch isn't worth dying for, go home and save your family. Right, or your commanders have fled, you know, you need to get out of the area, right? So we see this pinpoint propaganda information operations on them, you know, kind of tied with all these things. Otherwise, right, we've seen the Ukrainians, right, were having problems kind of getting their artillery to target Russian-led separatist forces, right? So they used, I think it was not Apple, but whatever the other one is. What is the Microsoft or Google use? The other server, right? But right, using this system, but then the Russians penetrate that and they can find out where they're shooting their artillery from, and then you kind of reverse engineering it through cyber means to then target them through their technology. So right, those are kind of the capabilities that we see, and these are things we're going to have to face out there. And then we see right anti-tank weapon systems right being very critical. Right, the Russians didn't really have anything to take out the Ukrainian tanks with their reactive armor. So one of the things we tried to do shortly after getting over there was figure out how to, try to get Ukrainians some Javelin missiles, right? So a Javelin is like an anti-tank weapons system or anti-vehicular weapon system, and instead of kind of at the side, it's a top attack weapon that's fire and forget. So it comes up and hits the vehicle from the top where its armor is the thinnest. So we thought this would be pretty simple. All you have to do is tell the new administration. The old administration didn't want to do this, so therefore you should do it. Right, just if the old administration did X, just do not X. But even that wasn't so simple. So it took about a year, and then ultimately, Javelins, some Javelin weapon systems went over there in December and January of December 14 or December 16, January of 17. And again, just enough, right? Not enough to make be a huge difference, but enough so that if the Russians are going to come across the border with their best tanks, they know these things are vulnerable. But yeah, so we can talk a little bit about how that policy piece works a little bit in Q&A if you want. So think, okay, so is Russia like a 10-foot monster, right? Are they, executed fait accompli in Crimea, brilliance, but is this exportable, right? Okay, where else can you do this? Okay, you think about what does it rely on? Okay, it relies on kind of probably somebody within their, right, at a border right next to them, right? So they have logistical means right there. It's got to be somewhere that has a large Russian population that gives it the excuse to go there. So you think, yes, a couple Baltic nations, Latvia and Estonia, not so much Lithuania. Right, so you've got to be able to have those things. And so thinking about how do you deter this Russian aggression, not so much maybe in Ukraine going forward, they're still in the middle of a fight, so they have to figure out how to resolve their conflict, but maybe for the Baltics, right? Okay, do they know if NATO will come to their defense? They hope NATO will, but again, coming to the defense and coming to liberate are two different things, right? And so if Russia could be in any of those capitals within a week, how fast could NATO react? By some one RAND study says it wouldn't be close, right? So then you're looking at, okay, this is a liberation versus defense. But right, it's about deterrent, right? Communicating to the Russians that this will cost, right? It's a cost-benefit calculus. Russia's actually, and Putin is actually fairly rational in what they do. So communicating to Putin, this is it'll be too costly for you to do this. We're going to communicate that on the front end so you'll never come in the first place. Right, so one is making the cost of, right, the invasion, increasing the cost of that, and then two, once they occupy, right, communicating to them it will be expensive, right? So the main thing, right, the message, kind of the porcupine strategy of this is, and communicating to them, this is not going to be the Baltics during the Cold War, this is going to be Afghanistan in the 80s, this is going to be Vietnam for us, or Iraq for us, right? And communicating that to the Russians so, okay, look at what they can do. Okay, so all the Baltic nations and Georgia too have basically given up their Air Force, right? If the Air Force didn't fly against their war with Georgia, if Georgia's war with Russia, and Ukraine the same thing, they had to ground the Air Force against a no-kidding threat. Why the heck are you investing in these expensive weapon systems? They're a waste of money. Same thing with their navies, right? They're like, a navy just is expensive, vulnerable platforms that are easily identifiable and easy to take out, and then we just wasted all that money on those things. So they have small coast guards, and so kind of divesting from those, right, expensive platforms, and think of air defense systems, right, not expensive Patriot missile systems that, again, are easy to identify and take out at the start of the war, And investing in smaller, right, and air defense, right, kind of man-pads we call them, right, like a Stinger missile, right? Can't identify where they are, right? You could have it in your car, right? You just pull it out. Same thing with anti-tank weapon systems like the Javelin, right? Again, not a tank that costs $6 million. That you think even if you have a good exchange ratio with the enemy, and you can take out 3 of their tanks to every one of yours, well, Russia will still just get you with mass, right? So you want to try to beat them, right? You can't outspend them, right? Think of what the GDP of these tiny nations is. When Russia spends almost as much on defense as right what their total GDP is, right? You can't outspend them, so you want to just increase the cost on the front end as much as possible. And in terms of air defense, what we saw in Georgia is Georgia took out one of a strategic bomber, a Russian strategic bomber, and really surprised Russia with that, and took out a number of other aircraft, and that really changed how Russia fought. Right, so you can do this, kind of take out Russia's air force, right? Then it makes it more of a ground battle, slows down the speed of the battle, and then you're going to have more success with these anti-tank weapon systems, right? And then kind of the third pillar is kind of increasing military defense, right? Increase the capability of what you already have, and that's what we're doing in Ukraine, right? How do we make them a more capable military force, right? Professionalization of the non-commissioned officer corps, right? Combined arms, right? Intelligence, whatever it is, logistics, medical services, right? How do we make them better at what they're doing without, right? With a relatively fixed budget, how do you be more efficient with what you have? And then, like I said, kind of the reserves, porcupine strategy. So each nation does a little different way of doing this. Lithuania has published 3 manuals of what to do in the case of a Russian invasion, and it's in their constitution, right? That if they get invaded, you're obligated to resist, right? To really, and then with the manuals, okay, who's the audience for this manual? They publish these online, print them, thousands of copies. Who's this manual for? Who's the intended audience?
Russia.
Right, it's the Russians, right? It's communicating to the Russians. We are serious about this. This isn't cheap talk, right? If you come across the border, again, this is not Cold War, where we didn't resist, right? They're embarrassed by their history and kind of teaching this history in the class, right? Civics, right? Re-emphasis on civil education and patriotism in the classroom. And then the other piece of it, right, is just decreasing Russian effectiveness, right? So 1, increasing your capability, and then 2, hey, making your system less, making yourself less vulnerable to these capabilities, right? Cyber, electronic warfare, information operations. I mean, we went to the Georgians' National Security Administration equivalent a couple years ago. So we're going to the building, I'm like, okay, where do you want me to put my cell phone? They're like, oh, you can keep it with you. I'm like, okay, this is why we have a problem. And then the last piece, right, I mean, decreasing corruption and increasing the legitimacy of the government, right? This isn't gonna work in the Baltics as long as they don't, administer language laws or something that'll, completely anger the ethnic Russian population, right? Again, you have in Latvia and Estonia, roughly 25 to 30% of the population is ethnic Russian. If you ask them who they cheer for during the Olympics, they will say Russia. If you ask them what they think they are Russian or Estonian, they will say they're Russian. They ask them if they want Estonia to be part of Russia, they will tell you no, right? They like their civil liberties, they like the higher standard of living that they have on that side of the border, right? And so until those nations do something to really alienate the population, if Putin tries to initiate kind of civil unrest there, they're gonna be like, hey, we don't want this. We've seen what Ukraine and Donbas looks like, and we want no part of that, right? No desire for that. And so, right, that's what you're trying to, and ultimately, right, what Russia's main effort really is political subversion. I mean, they may want to take over the Baltics and Ukraine again, but I think they look at the world the way it is. It's probably not a realistic strategy. So short of that, hey, just political subversion, let's just make them weak, and that's enough, right? Making the West look weak, legitimizing it, right, and it is always good for Russia. Yeah, this just shows you, I mean, just some quick numbers, right? These are, numbers, but this kind of shows you, in 2014, this is kind of like by size, how much aid was, but if you think of what U.S. foreign military aid was to Ukraine in 2014, it was very small, and then you kind of see what it is, again, this is in 2016, yes. But it's still really a relatively modest effort, right? $525 million is really not that significant in terms of the money that we spend elsewhere and for the threat they're facing. Leave with a couple things here to kind of think about. So this kind of attitude towards Russia, the public opinion, and this is attitude towards the United States. So right here, obviously this is 2014, February 2014. But right, pretty positive attitude towards Russia. And again, this is gonna be, you know, it's probably 52% because everybody in the East is gonna be in the South is like, yes, Russia. And the West are kind of like, not so much, but, you know, 12% against, and the rest are just kind of neutral. We see this kind of really just changing here in 2014. And those numbers have stayed pretty consistent since. And then the attitude toward you, that's less important, right? But those have been pretty consistent as well. And so, you know, you gotta wonder, okay, what's Putin's long-term, what's his long-term gain here, right? If it is to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and the EU, right? Success, right? It's tough to do when you have these contested borders. But if his long-term gain is to make Ukraine turn back east, right? He is failing in that. And the longer this lasts, the more and more he's locking it in, right? Some would say, hey, Ukraine, you know, his actions there really made Ukraine a nation that it never really was prior. And so the longer this goes on, right, you know, is Putin, is he getting what he wants out of this? Arguably not. Yeah, I don't need that. And the last thing, I mean, these are just kind of showing violations. These are like, you know, 2,000, 4,000. These are, you know, daily or, you know, or weekly violations in this, you know, what was formerly the anti-terrorist operation, now joint forces operational area in the East. But what it's showing is that there's a significant, right, significant violations of those Minsk treaties on a daily basis, numbering in the hundreds or thousands each day. And then kind of I'll wrap it up. I mean, for them, this is gonna be a long war, right? What's the end state for this, right? This is a significant burden in terms of rotation of troops for Ukraine out there. For Russia, right, it's still a relative bargain, right? It doesn't costing them that much for what it is, and it is costing Ukrainians, right? But everybody that we've talked with over there, you know, conducting the training and assistance missions for the Ukrainians, right? They all say, hey, these are not Afghanis or Iraqis. This is a highly educated populace. It's highly motivated, and the quality of the soldiers is much, much higher than Afghanistan and Iraq. The other piece I'll say, I forgot to mention on the policy piece. So when we first took over, right, what we were providing was, there was a decision made, you know, I think primarily by Susan Rice under the previous administration, that we're gonna provide non-lethal aid to the Ukrainians. So that meant we couldn't provide Javelin weapon systems, we couldn't provide sniper weapon systems, and we could provide certain kind of training. We wouldn't provide sniper training, but we would provide basic kind of soldier training. I don't know what the heck non-lethal weapons are, what non-lethal training is, right? Everything you do in the military is lethal. I don't understand what that means. So we tried to just kind of change that terminology. We're like, there is no such thing as lethal aid, right? It's just defensive aid. We were providing them aid to defend themselves. And so it took a while to kind of, it took about a year to kind of get that, you know, to kind of change the verbiage of that and then kind of clean it up. Then it's not a decision, okay, what's lethal, what's non-lethal? Hey, no, what is defensive aid that they need to defend themselves? And again, this cost of aid is still, I mean, it's relatively minimal. And right, I mean, they're still, right, if maybe Ukraine will eventually retire. I mean, they haven't gotten, it's been 3-4 years now on that graph I just showed you, but hey, at some point, maybe Ukraine just gets tired and goes, okay, we're never gonna join NATO, we're never gonna join EU. The West really isn't helping us, maybe we're just gonna turn back to our big brother, to the big bear. All right, so with that, I will wrap it up so we have time for questions.
That some people theorize that that's where Russian warfighters would go through to hit the front of the West, NATO, in general.
Yeah, so, I mean, like I said, the studies show, yeah, Russia could probably get through there pretty quick. The question is, right, does this enhanced forward presence, the rotation of NATO brigades into Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Poland, does it create a deterrent against Russia? Right, the deterrence is really hard to measure. Because just because Russia doesn't do anything, did they choose not to, or did that action of ours actually deter them from doing something? So no one really knows. I mean, I think maybe the deterrent force is done better, is doing a better job now. I mean, when we talked to one commander that was there, not a U.S. commander, but it was in one of the Baltic nations that was in charge of the enhanced forward presence mission. We're like, what happens if the Russians come across the border? He's like, I don't know. I don't really have directions for that. So we're like, okay, we gotta do a better job with our information operations, so it's clear what they're gonna do, right? You're gonna defend. You're gonna defend our allies that are there. Other ones, we asked, hey, what is the Russian capability in terms of electronic warfare? And they're like, we have no idea. And I'm like, well, the first thing they're gonna do is jam your communications or cut you off, and then you're not gonna have any direction, right? So if you're sitting here waiting for guidance, you're not gonna get it because it's gonna be severed. I think they've improved since then, but that was, 2 or 3 years ago. We're sending this force over there to be a deterrent, and they aren't sure what they're doing. So I don't know. I mean, do I think Russia's going to go in the Baltics? No, right? I mean, not unless there's some kind of a thing. Just like they probably wouldn't have gone in Ukraine without, right, that target of opportunity that we took advantage. They tested the West and they won, right? The West didn't push back. So they could do that again in the Baltics, but at the same time, right, they can't going to be able to replicate this, right? The surprise is gone. The element of surprise is gone. Right, we've actually, now we're, we didn't learn from 2008, but I think we've learned since 2014. Yeah.
A couple of months ago, Governor Jerry Brown of California was here, and he said his primary concern in the world was nuclear war. Is there do you see anything in what you've talked about there that would precipitate a much larger confrontation between the West and Russia?
Right, so I think that was the previous administration's fear, right? If we provide them javelins, somehow this is gonna escalate into nuclear war. And Russia, right, their rhetoric was, hey, if you provide javelins to them, it's gonna be a game changer. Right, this is kind of their rhetoric was pretty consistent up until the summer of 2016. And then once it became apparent that they were probably gonna get javelins, we see all of a sudden Russia's rhetoric change. And like, oh, javelins aren't, it doesn't matter if you give them javelins, it's not gonna change anything. So, it just, right, I mean, maybe at a certain level, but it's not like it's gonna I don't think Putin and Russia wants to go to a nuclear war any more than we do. Obviously, their interests matter more there. Yeah, I guess you could do something that would trip into it. I think we're way, way below that threshold. I think Russia's way below that threshold. But yeah, it would be, it'd be hard to stumble into that, but, never underestimate the ability of something to happen. Yeah, the back first. Yeah.
Yes, those of us who can remember the 80s and 90s remember that in the 90s, Russia was actually our ally, and now, 25 years later, we seem to be entering a new Cold War. And so, when I remember the Cold War, and obviously in 1962, we were willing to go eyeball to eyeball over Russian missiles, in a country, Cuba, 90 miles off our coast, because we had a Monroe Doctrine. And now, even though Putin wants desperately to be a strategic partner, is the term he uses, he wants to be an ally to the U.S., what have we done to him? I mean, he helped us in Afghanistan by letting us use bases in the former Soviet Union, and yet, how have we repaid him? Well, we've expanded NATO, as you correctly mentioned, and of course, George Bush ended the ABM treaty, and, so it's like, here we are, in a situation where I do think we're trying to play Russian roulette with a Russian bear that has 7,700 nuclear weapons. And, Obama claimed, the one great principle of U.S. foreign policy is don't do stupid things. I mean, isn't that a stupid thing?
Well, I want to say, first of all, just because we've engaged in dialogue and partnerships with them doesn't mean we were ever allies with Russia. And they were in a weakened state there, right? They couldn't push back. I think once the price of oil rebounded, right, and then they could push the West and test the West, and when the West doesn't push back, they keep taking advantage of it, right? So it's not saying, hey, we're going to elevate to a nuclear war, but we can sit back and do nothing, and they can take Crimea, and they can take all of Ukraine, or you can push back a little, right, and respect a democratic a nation that wants to be democratic, give them limited support that most likely is not going to trigger a nuclear war, and you can provide that kind of support, right? They had some selfish interest in supporting our efforts into Afghanistan, right, and they're very helpful, right, in the international community in Syria, meaning they can, right, they're leveraging it to do what they want versus what we want and the West wants. But yeah, there's still places we can look for agreement with them. We can be adversaries on something and still partner on other things. So you can't totally close that off versus more in the Cold War, where it's kind of everything was adversarial. There is places where we can overlap with them. But to just say, hey, if we do anything to Russia, they all of a sudden go to nuclear war, I don't see that happening. Yes.
What is your team and the U.S. government doing to prepare for the eventual potential that there's gonna be a comedian as president of Ukraine, and how is that going to impact your power in helping Ukraine maintain its sovereignty?
Yeah, I haven't gone over since, he came off the mission in 2000, late last year for obvious reasons. But the president is the president, as long as he wants advice from international community, and he's committed to kind of defense reform and kind of Western standards, which I have no reason to believe he won't be, I don't think it will significantly change the relationship. If you have a president come in that all of a sudden wants to turn east and kind of look back to Russia, yeah, then probably the mission will be done, right? Because they've made the decision. But I don't see, I don't see it changing with the most likely, if he's elected president or if Poroshenko stays. Yeah.
You said that hybrid war is not, it's not a new thing, but as it becomes more prevalent, how has NATO doctrine adapted to, these different and these new hybrid threats across all the warfighting functions?
Yeah, we haven't done a good job, okay? If you look at, the Russians did a chemical nerve agent attack in a sovereign nation in Salisbury last year, right? It didn't trigger an Article 5 commitment, right? Nobody looked at it and said this is an act of war, right? So chemical weapons are we haven't figured out what that is. Cyber, right? What constitutes an act of war in terms of cyber? So we haven't come to terms with what these things mean yet. Again, when does little green men all of a sudden become, right, when is that an act of war? I don't think we've kind of figured those things out. If you look at the training and stuff, I've been to kind of the combat training centers. Yeah, we haven't done a good job of, we will say, and again, I should open up with it, but I don't speak on behalf of the U.S. government or the Army, right? These are my opinions, right? But, we will justify, right, we will use Russia and point to it to justify buying expensive weapon systems, because that's what we do. But we won't fundamentally change how we fight. If we say electronic warfare is a real threat, then we have to change the way we fight. Right? We're overly dependent on GPS technology, communication systems. But then if you go out to any military unit, you'll still see a giant antenna farm right next to any kind of battalion headquarters that's basically just emanating electronic signatures that says drop artillery on me. And we haven't changed that. Right? So if we're not going to change that, we make the easy changes of wanting to justifying buying expensive equipment, but the hard changes that are cultural, right, changing the way we fight, those are harder to do, right? Those are always harder changes to implement, and we haven't done that. So I don't think we've done a good job against the real threat. Yes.
Was any message being sent when the Malaysian Airlines 777 was shot down?
What about it?
Malaysian Airlines 777. Was any message being sent?
I don't know what you mean by that. I think that was an accident by the Russian-led separatists. I don't think they meant to take down a commercial airline. Russia and them, I don't think anybody would have any, again, I could be wrong, but I don't think they have anything to be gained by taking down a commercial airline. Right? It's kind of like sending, conventional forces across the border. It just leads to problems. So I don't think that was intentional.
Their question is there organized ethnic cleansing going on behind the separatist lines, potentially in anticipation of annexation, sort of, not necessarily linguistically, but separate those that are comfortable under Russian rule from those that are less comfortable, encourage them to move?
No, we haven't been across the border, but I've seen no indications of that. Most people they're leaving voluntarily because they don't want to be in a conflict zone, right, or they don't want to be part of Russia, and so they might be leaving separately. Most people just want, right, and many of the separatists aren't true separatists. Some of them are just criminals, or some of them are just, right, they don't have any other option, right? That's the only form of labor that they have, and so that's what they're doing. And so when you think about what the Russian-led separatists are, right, it's a small minority that are really hardcore committed, separatists that are willing to fight. Most of them are, right, they're just looking for a job, and they want to return to normalcy. But no, we really haven't seen that. And the same thing, right, in Crimea, or the Ukrainians that are down there, a lot of the Navy just kind of like, okay, I guess we'll just stay down here. We have a house. What would I have to gain by leaving Crimea and going to Ukraine? I have nothing. The government can't pay me anything. Here I have a house, right? So we haven't seen. I haven't seen any of that. Maybe at really low level, but I haven't seen it. Yeah.
Have you at the Academy done any kind of lessons learned between our approach to the Soviets, domino theory, checking their thing, sort of the nuclear war versus today, parallels, differences?
Like one of the things I like to do is bring the cadet, we do like we call contemporary battlefield assessment. We go out and look at modern conflicts, right? What can we learn by them? They're often understudied. We have a bias, to study only U.S. conflicts. And so one of my faculty members found this picture of cadets in like 1919, and they were going out to study the Great War. We never thought there'd be another war, but they were going out to study to see what they could learn from this. And so we're like, hey, we need to be doing that. Yeah, we can't get cadets to Afghanistan or Iraq, it's kind of hard, but where else can we go? So, a few years ago, went to Sri Lanka, right? Studied their counterinsurgency against the Tamil Tigers, right? A lot could be learned from there. Now, some of it, may not be applicable elsewhere. There's certain advantage they have being on an island that could be relatively closed off. Fighting a group that was, then eventually designated a foreign terrorist organization, but they were the most successful, use of suicide terror in the world, right? They had a navy, some suicide navy vessels too. I mean, they'll claim they had an air force. They had 2 airplanes where they dropped grenades or something out of, they didn't have an air force. But ultimately, right, they won that counterinsurgency. And you go back there and you talk to the, and you talk to them, and they're like, they didn't resolve any of the underlying causes of the conflict, but no one has a desire to return to violence, right? So, kind of studying that, we went to Georgia because my feeling was, okay, if we had a better understanding of what happened in 2008, I don't think we would have been surprised or caught with our pants down in 2014. The Russians wouldn't have been able to if we actually studied and learned from it, both in the military and the political leadership. And then last year we went to down to Colombia to study their kind of the DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of the FARC, right? This is, again, a long-lasting insurgency that has a lot of similarities to Afghanistan, right? Large borders, a lot of relatively under or ungoverned terrain, by the mountainous terrain there, just like mountainous terrain in Afghanistan, right? A large drug problem in terms of, right, where they're, and so a lot of similarities. We want to understand, we're trying to figure out, hey, can we reconcile with the Taliban or the Haqqani network? That's a good place to turn to see what lessons can we learn from there. And then we also went to, this past summer, Baltics and Ukraine to kind of look at deterrent Russian aggression, seeing what each Baltic nation is doing and what Ukraine is doing. Again, Ukraine's a little different because they're still fighting a war, but how do they think about this threat? So that we look at like that, and what can we learn by these other conflicts and apply today? And again, one of the thing that frustrates me is the MRAP vehicle, right? Those are those heavy V-shaped hull vehicles. Ultimately, we probably bought more than we needed. But there were a couple majors in the Marine Corps that were arguing in 2004 that we needed this, right? Simple physics just tells you, right, this is how you want a vehicle, right? A mine or an improvised explosive device underneath a vehicle, if you don't have a hull and you elevate it off the ground, right, it's gonna go through that vehicle no matter how much armor you put on that thing. So these guys were arguing like 2004 to get this. Why were they arguing for it? They both grew up in South America and saw it during the Rhodesian War, right, or in South Africa. And they built this. The Rhodesians built it from the ground up in about 4 years under apartheid because no one in the international community would support it, right? And we didn't learn in Vietnam, right? We just continued to kind of do strap-on armor and other things. Why? Because, right, these vehicles are heavier. They don't fit our expeditionary war mindset, right? So we want to fight expeditionary. We can have lighter vehicles. We can put in an aircraft, fly, drop them somewhere, and then go out and do operations. That's great, but everything on the intelligence side says that's not the environment you're facing. The environment you're facing has an enemy that's capable of putting mines and improvised explosive devices everywhere. So we kind of throw that out because it doesn't fit our model of war, and then we don't have the right vehicle. So that's, for us, it's studying those kind of things so we don't make the same mistakes over and over again, or at least minimizing, because we still will. Yeah, in the back.
Yes. I was wondering if you might comment on how do you interpret the recent Russian decision to withdraw from all cooperation and engagement with NATO?
Yeah, I'm less of an expert kind of on that level. I don't know how much cooperation was going on before. So.
Well, there was a fair amount of at least engagement. There was an openness in terms of trying to keep the Russians from, you know, viewing NATO in the way they have been. I mean, to be more transparent and so on, and they were part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it changes, I mean, I think it's more of a political act more than anything else. I don't think it changed what they're trying to do or what they're trying to accomplish. Yeah.
Would you comment on our policy versus the Russian policy in Syria and what we've done right or wrong and what we ought to be doing in the future to tamp down their influence there?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't studied, I haven't studied Syria in enough depth, I think, to make a good comment on it. I mean, I could wing it, but it's not an area where I think I have the expertise. Yeah.
Thanks, Colonel, for a fascinating presentation. It seems like another way to frame this story might be that Russia has become involved in two sort of intractable ground conflicts in Georgia and in the Ukraine. The only place it's had real strategic success is in the Crimea, which may just be an accident of geography, the fact that it's an isolated peninsula. Do you get any sense that they might be learning that hybrid warfare is actually not very effective?
I mean, I wouldn't say, I mean, it's the hybrid war versus, I mean, that's kind of the action piece, and then the political, what is the end state, right? But I would say no. I mean, Georgia, I mean, I think it is, they're getting what they want, and I think it is a bargain. At the same time, they have no desire to annex those, right? So eventually they can just walk away if they want, right? They're not willing to do that, and they could probably walk away from Abkhazia and South Ossetia at any time and probably be pretty fine. It's not like South Ossetia or Abkhazia is going to all of a sudden run and join, you know, want to be completely Georgian, right? There's no desire for them to do that. And so, no, I don't think it's really costing them much there. Crimea, right, yes, it has worked there. In Donbas, yeah, I mean, I think I think it was more of a target of opportunity. He saw how much success he had in Crimea. The fact that they didn't resist at all emboldened him to kind of support the separatists where he probably wouldn't have otherwise, right? If he would have met resistance in Crimea, I think when the separatists kind of stood up in the east, he would have been like, you know, not really interested. I'll give you a little bit, but I'm not going to send Russian regulars across the border. I think that just kind of, he kept kind of getting trapped, giving it more and more and more. So I think he did make a mistake there, and he's got to figure out what's the end game. How do I get out of here? Right, it's just as hard, probably even harder for Putin to walk out of a conflict than it is for like the U.S., any of our, you know, to walk out of Afghanistan, right? It's even harder for him to do that. And so it's trying to figure out what kind of deal can you come to where he can walk out and kind of save face, and I'm not sure what that was. I thought the best opportunity he had was right after Trump won, right? They had this bromance going on at the time. He could give the Donbas back to Ukraine to kind of like reset relationships, and clearly that opportunity has long since passed. And so now I don't know what the end state there, but I don't think it's so much the matter of the strategy and the hybrid war that he used. It's more of like what's the political end state of the outcome that he's trying to achieve. I think it's so. It wasn't so much the means. I think it's the ends that are the issue really in Donbas. Yeah.
It seems to me like hybrid wars, from their perspective, can be all over the place. It's not all of those items that you listed, but it could be pieces and parts of it. Venezuela and Syria, maybe Hungary. Can you touch on that a little bit? Obviously, Venezuela's not a NATO ally. Hungary is, obviously, Syria is not. So is Russia kind of playing games to kind of throw us off at the same time?
I mean, they're right there. I mean, it's political subversion. I mean, that's what they've been doing for decades, and that's kind of their main goal. So, right, this is a way to accomplish political subversion. You know, so I mean, you can call it hybrid war down there, but they're just using the tools that they have to, right, undermine or weaken the West, right, or in Syria, right, kind of get to an outcome that they want in Syria, and using, you could argue, hybrid means to get that, you know. But that, I mean, that's kind of what they're, you know, it's kind of, you know, a different version of the Cold War. It's not the Cold War, but it's, you know, there's some similarities. Yes.
Does the U.S. have a uniform policy on how to deal with Russia and all this? I mean, I've never heard one stated.
Well, that was what we asked pretty much the first day on the job, is what's the policy? I mean, some will say there is a clear policy, you know, I'm not so sure there's a clear policy. But and it's all tied together, right? You gotta have a Russian policy. You can't have a policy with Ukraine without having, what's our Russia policy? And so, yeah, that was always something to do. I mean, we met with, again, we were kind of trying to figure out what our policy is with Ukraine. We met with, Secretary Mattis, through Tillerson, and we meet with, Tillerson was on board, and Mattis was on board, and all three kind of were on the same thing, and then you just kind of figure out, still, how would you get to the policy on that? Give you a funny story. So, like, we're meeting General McMaster, like his second job on the job, second week on the job as National Security Advisor. So we're going to meet him in the West Wing. So he used to work for General Abizaid. So we go in there and see him. He's like, we're doing the meeting with him afterwards. Like, sir, I want you to come up, meet my staff. So we go up there. We're meeting in the West Wing of the White House. We go up to meet his staff. We get up there, and as soon as we get up there, General Abizaid's like, McMaster was the worst aide I ever had. This one time he left my bag and whatever, and I was like, oh crap, I just left Abizaid's bag in the West Wing of the White House. So I was just following where the pack was going. So I run out of that office. I'm like, get to this. I think it was this way. I get to this door, and it's locked, and there's a phone on the wall. I pick up the phone. I'm like, hello? Can you open the door? It opens up, and I go through there, and it's like a game show. There's like 3 more doors. I'm like, I was just following people. I wasn't paying attention where I was going. I try the first door. I'm like, I hope it's not like the vice president or the first lady doing a meeting. I open it, like, no one's there. Open the second door. I'm like, there it is. There's the bag. Get that now. I'm like, now where do I go? I'm like, I think it was over here, but I was following the pack. So I run up there just as he comes out, just as he's finishing up, and there he's like, all right, you ready to go? I'm like, yes, sir. Hand him his bag. He never did. But yeah, nothing like running around, squirreling around the West Wing of the White House. Yes.
You talk a lot about the hybrid, but to what extent is there sort of an escalation much more to the cyber world? You have going on now GPS spoofing and creating separate GPS systems. A number of people are doing that. You have more with space, you have more with the internet. To what extent that doesn't depend upon so much of having military might across the border. It can be disruptive, it can be any place. To what extent is the war moving to a different country?
Yeah, it's just a matter of where do those vulnerabilities lie. So yeah, right, if you remember when we launched, I think after one of the chemical attacks, we launched some missiles into Syria, right? And Russia, said, hey, we're going to jam these things up, and they ultimately either didn't or couldn't, right? So what their capability is still uncertain. Don't know if they just didn't or couldn't do it. But no doubt, right? The democratization of technology, right? Actors in lower and lower levels, right, can have this technology. We used to have, I equate it to, we used to have advantage of measured by years or decades in terms of technology, right? So in 2003, when I was in Iraq, we were going to go to this, hit a target, and we had British 22 SAS living in a house next door to us. And I was asked my colonel, okay, how many guys can you give me for this operation, guys? I can give you like 8 tonight, or I can give you like 20 tomorrow. I'm like, where are the rest of the guys tonight? He's like, well, I only have 8 night vision goggles. The rest of them are coming tomorrow. I'm like, what do you mean? You went to combat without your night vision goggles? And he says, no, we only have 1 for every 3 guys. I'm like, I was a platoon leader in 1993, and my lowliest private had, high quality night vision goggles, right? So we had an advantage that was measured in years and decades, right? And that's, right, again, the democratization of technology and stuff, and it used to be the military led the technology gap. Now it's right the civilian side, right? So that's gone, right? ISIS can fly drones and buy them and kick them out to the field pretty fast. We're still having an antiquated acquisition process, right? The process makes sense for large, expensive items. Might not make sense for other things. And so you've got this, and so yeah, we have other vulnerabilities, right? It's not just now, right? Who's got the biggest tank and the best aircraft, right? And so when you got China doing, right, anti-access area denial investment in that, and we're, of course they're investing in that. To try to invest symmetrically with us would be pure lunacy, looking at our defense budget and theirs, right? Why fight our strength why fight our strength, right? Find our vulnerabilities, right? So we continue to invest more in the heavy weapon systems, and we're underinvested in the systems that we're relying on, right? So I mean, that's part of the reason for creating a Space Force. It's kind of emphasis on these, right, satellites and other things, right, that we're dependent on that can either be targeted, right, through cyber means or through kinetic means. So yeah, without a doubt, we are overly dependent on these, right, on multiple levels, right? So think about, for the older folks in here, right, when you used to travel across country, how did you navigate? Right, you had a map, and you would open up the map and you would go that way. You had this spatial awareness, right? When everybody, and it's not here, but right, when everybody just navigates with a phone that just tells them where to go, they have no idea what is east, west. They can't, like, if you ask them, how did you get there? They couldn't on a map sketch it out, right? Or you could if you're using that, right, same device. All right, I got here today through Uber or something, right? If I was to sketch, no, I looked at the map this morning, so I could do it, right? But most people couldn't do it, right? Because they're just going from there. And so you got people that come in the military, right? And then you want them to navigate, but they're relying on technology until it's jammed and like, okay, right, this is, now what do we do, right? Or we have Blue Force Tracker, so you got, right, it kind of goes back to when around the 2000s, we were like in this, the talk was we're in a revolution of military affairs, right? If we just, with precision guided munitions and information dominance, right, we can win everything. At the time, I thought it was a bunch of crap, and I'm like, I think Iraq pretty much proved that out. I'm like, I don't see how this is going to help me when I'm in the streets fighting, right? How is this going to help me on the streets of Fallujah to have this? It does nothing for me at this level, right? And so it helped for part of the conflict, but it's not going to get you there. And this is the same thing, right? We're overly dependent on that. And going back to the culture piece that I've been arguing, like, hey, we're not training for this threat. And so my thing is, okay, at the academy, we should have what we should be doing for intramurals is things like orienteering, right? Whereas we have a higher, right, we at least graduate a higher number that actually can go and navigate in the woods instead of playing soccer or something. Soccer's great, you get a good workout. I'm not sure how good that is translate to a military skill. But orienteering, right, and I've seen it because I've coached our team at the World Military Championships, and you go against like the Russians, the Latvians, the Swiss. Like these are, if it was an Olympic sport, these would be medalists, right? These people can go through the woods. It's like they glance at a map and they just take off running. It's unbelievable, and they're just like no bodily harm. So when I was a little younger in shape, I mean, I could go, a sub 30 10K through the woods or something, but I mean, these guys do it while they're navigating. And like to the point of like, if they don't get to right where the point is, they look at the map and they just see his head just like this, and then like move like 10 degrees off and go, and I knew exactly what he's thinking. Like, I just lost 3 seconds there. I can never get back. Like they're not all at that level. That's their world class. But we just start training in those kind of things, right? So if we say the threat is we're overly dependent on satellites and cyber and everything, part of it is a technological solution, which the U.S., right, we have a bias to invest in technology. But culturally, we don't make the change because that's hard. Cultural change is hard in any organization, and that we aren't doing. That's where I think we need to do more of, right? Technology, yeah, it only gets you part way. It'll always come down to people, right? I mean, at least for the Army, right? War is fought on terrain with people, at least for the foreseeable future. Maybe drones down the road, but that's going to be much, way, way, way farther away than people think.
On that note, I think we'll just say thank you so much for a great